The Crimean War, as we have discussed in the previous talk, marked the end of a phase of Eastern question when the principal consideration was how Russian advancement in the southeastern Europe at the expense of the Ottoman Empire could be prevented. Once the Crimean War came to a close by the Treaty of Paris, a new dimension began to appear. Almost all the European powers, interestingly Russia included, were determined to prevent Ottoman disintegration right then. Russia had been forced to quit her military stations in the Black Sea, around the Black Sea. So Russia was particularly keen that while Russia was allowed to recuperate, the Ottoman Empire would hold on to the straits as neutral ground, so that just as Russia could not cross the straits into the Mediterranean, neither could any other power cross the straits into the Black Sea. So Russia, for the first time in 100 years, was willing to prevent the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. The British were committed anyway to prevent the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in order to guard their passage to India. The French were not particularly willing to see whatever commercial influence they had remaining in that region disappear either. And even more interestingly, the Habsburgs, who had driven the Ottomans out from the gates of Vienna in the 17th century and had fought with the Ottomans all through the middle of the 18th century, were now prepared to underwrite Ottoman integrity, the integrity of the Ottoman Empire, in order to keep the Russians out. So, in the constellation of forces in 1856, there was no external threat that remained in the Ottoman Empire. All the problems that could come at this point of time could come only from inside the empire. And this is precisely what happened in the Balkans. In the 1860s, the Ottoman Empire's greatest problem lay in the progressive deterioration of its financial health. Between 1856 and 1870s, the public debt of the government rose from £4 million to about 20 million. For an empire which was desperately trying to shore up its military strength, as also bring about structural reforms, the financial health resulted in a considerable degree of worry. For the Ottomans, the various solutions, the one that seemed to be the least likely to create further problems was to tax heavily. The problem was that the Ottoman provinces in southeastern Europe were already reasonably heavily taxed. So when the Ottomans increased their tax burdens in the southeastern European provinces of the empire, rumblings of dissent began to be heard. In 1872-73, a series of harvest disasters as well as other problems led to a downwards movement of the agricultural cycle. Agricultural productivity began to decline, crop failures were occasioned. This, however, was not accompanied by any remission in tax collection, because the Ottomans did not dare cut down on its tax demand, because it would have made the Ottoman finances collapse completely. There was an agrarian revolt which began in Herzegovina, which was in the Dalmatian Peninsula, which then immediately spread northwards into Bosnia. Bosnia and Herzegovina, inhabited predominantly by Muslims of Serbo-Croat background, was the heartland of Ottoman presence in the Dalmatian Peninsula. Once the problem began to surface in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it began to have greater regional repercussions as well. Right next to Bosnia-Herzegovina, to the east of Bosnia-Herzegovina, lay the autonomous province of Serbia. Serbia was predominantly Orthodox Christian, and ever since its defeat at the hand of the Ottomans in the 14th century, the Serbs had been more or less loyal to the Ottoman Empire for a very long time. till the early 19th century. As a result of two uprisings taking place in the first quarter of the 19th century, the Serbians had been granted the status of an autonomous province. When the uprising began in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it affected the lives of Serbs living in Bosnia-Herzegovina. There were problems which spilled over into the autonomous province as well, and the Serbs too joined this uprising. For very similar reasons of increased tax burden, the Bulgars, which lay to the north of Serbia, also decided to join the uprising. So in 1874, the Ottoman Empire was faced with the prospect of a general uprising in whatever remained of its European provinces. Ottoman attempt at military subjugation of the uprising was followed by a series of very tragic incidents. The Bulgarians, when they rose up in arms, they carried out a massacre of whatever Ottoman presence was there. So when the Ottomans moved in to suppress, they followed it up with a round of massacres of their own, carried out against the Bulgarians, which is known as the Bulgarian horrors. For European powers, the sight of a Muslim Turkish authority carrying out oppression of Christian subjects was a difficult one to contemplate. For Russia, it was nothing short of disastrous. Because while the Russians were determined after 1856 to prevent the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and were not going to push for the warm water policy in any way, the pan-Slavic dimension of their policy began to raise problems. From after the Crimean War, there was this growing sense in Russia that as the largest of the Slavic people, the Russians should take the initiative of expanding and embracing all the various Slavic people speaking languages of Slavic origin, into constituting one single Slavic state. This doctrine of pan-Slavism had its resonance in Poland, which was of Slavic background, in Bulgaria, in Romania, and generally speaking in the regions of the Dalmatian Peninsula, which were inhabited by the people known as the Southern Slavs or the Yugoslavs, comprising of the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosnians, Herzegovinians, and at this point of time, even the Bulgarians. So when atrocities were committed against the Slavic people of Bulgaria, it was very difficult for the Tsarist government, which had a sizable number of its advisors of pan-Slavic persuasion, to sit idle. Russia was equally determined to prevent any kind of Crimean coalition being revived, where Britain, France, Austria would be able to combine against it. There was this additional consideration of the Russian budget. Russian finances were of such a state that they were not able to embark on a policy of aggrandizement right away. Russia wanted to avoid conflict as far as possible. So the Russians decided to move for an international conference which would somehow manage to resolve this crisis. The British were absolutely adamant on underwriting the unity and integrity of the Ottoman Empire, so they were not very concerned about what was going on at this point of time. The French were not willing to let Russia have any upper hand in this region, so they also stayed away from the concert. But given the escalating proportions of the atrocities committed by the Ottoman Empire, Russians decided to move towards a military resolution with the support of other European powers. It was at this stage that what was known as the Three Emperors League, the Dreikanzlerverhaltnis, was invoked by the Russians to bring the real opponent of Russian advance into the Balkans, the Habsburg Empire, into the question. With Bismarck as the mediator, Andrassy, who was representing Vienna, and Gorshakov, who was representing Russia, settled on a term of engagement under which the Russians would persuade the Ottoman Empire to bring about structural reforms in the region, stop atrocities right away. Should they fail to do so, this would lead to war. Istanbul, when faced with the proposal from the Dreikanzlerverhaltnis to bring about a total structural overhaul of its European provinces, decided to reject the idea altogether, given the diplomatic backing that it had from London. It was in this background that Russia intervened in 1876 with Austrian endorsement. Now, Austrian endorsement of Russian intervention came with one major precondition, that if the Ottoman Empire was to collapse in southeastern Europe, it would not be replaced by any single major European state, a new major European state in the region. The conflict that followed in between 1876 and 78 was a crucial one for the history of Eastern Europe, because Russia moved precipitately into the Balkan regions. Now, the news of the Bulgarian horrors had turned the public opinion in England against the Ottomans for a time being. So when the sight of Russian advance was seen in London, London could not immediately retaliate with military attack against Russian positions. The gallant defense mounted by the Turks at Plevna, which completely halted the precipitated Russian advance, swung the tides of public opinion in favor of the Ottomans once again. Although after a grueling battle of around 6 months, the Russians finally reduced Plevna and began to knock on the doors of Istanbul, by that time the Russian strength had petered away. Indeed, the Ottoman Empire, for all practical purposes, had disappeared in Europe because the army was beginning to crumble. Nevertheless, the defense at Plevna, mounted by the Turks, had weakened the Russian advance so dreadfully that the Russians did not dare move any further. There was also the consideration that the British had once presented before the Russian intervention began, that any advance into Istanbul would be taken as a direct declaration of war against Britain. So Russia decided to call for truce even as it was on the verge of entering Istanbul. The resultant treaty that was signed, the Treaty of San Stefano, led to the creation of a major Bulgarian state. Russia wanted a new state to emerge on the southeastern Balkans, embracing the regions of Rumelia and the Bulgar provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and also the northern region of Greece that we now today call Macedonia. The huge Bulgarian state that was created was in direct contradiction to the Andrassy-Gorchakov understanding of 2 years before that. So the Ottoman Sultan was reasonably certain that this treaty would not be allowed to stand. So when the Russians proposed the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano to embrace the creation of a new state of Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire signed it, secure with the assumption that the other European powers would not accept it. And true to their anticipation, Vienna, Paris, and London decided to oppose this creation of a new state. London, in fact, guaranteed opening of hostilities unless the Treaty of San Stefano was annulled. Diplomatic activity, a flurry of diplomatic activity followed, as a result of which Bismarck decided to offer his services as the honest broker in what was to be known as the Berlin Congress of 1878. Now, in the Berlin Congress, what was decided was that the big state of Bulgaria that had been created by the Treaty of San Stefano would actually be then divided into three. There was to be the state of Bulgaria minus the regions of Rumelia, because Rumelia had a large Greek and large Turkish population, and the region of Macedonia, which was overwhelmingly Greek. These, Rumelia and Macedonia, would remain under Ottoman Empire, whereas the Bulgarians were allowed to have complete autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. Additionally, the Ottoman Empire had to pledge itself to structural reforms in whatever remained of its empire. Bosnia-Herzegovina was handed over to the Austria-Hungarian dual monarchy, so for administration, even though nominally Bosnia and Herzegovina remained within the Ottoman Empire. The autonomous provinces of Serbia and the regions of Moldavia, Wallachia and Bessarabia, together compiled as Romania, the Serbia and Romania and Montenegro were given the status of independent states. So the Ottoman disintegration that began in the 1870s, leading to the emergence of new nationalities, was basically triggered off by the Berlin Congress in 1878. Once the Berlin Congress came to an end, the diplomatic alignments in Europe, the battle lines over the issue of Eastern question began to change somewhat. Because Russia was no longer planning to engineer the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, they were keener on having a satellite state on the Balkans. And they believed that their backing for the creation of a new Bulgaria would ultimately win them a satellite state in Sofia, in Bulgaria that is. However, as it happened, once Bulgaria came of its own as an autonomous entity, it did not actually have any truck with Russia as far as possible. And this prompted Russia to move against Bulgaria within 7 years, when the province of Rumelia decided to merge with Bulgaria. Russia decided to oppose it. And once again, Britain had to intervene, this time round, in favor of a state of Bulgaria, absorbing Rumelia, because they could see that since Sofia was going to be of independent mind, the Russian shadow would not approach on the Balkans in any way. But the more decisive shift that takes place as a result of the Berlin Congress of 1878 was a higher profile that Austria-Hungary began to develop in this region. The reason why Austria-Hungary had intervened in Bosnia-Herzegovina by taking up the task of administering the region was very simple. Just like the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire too was multi-ethnic, and it had a large number of subject nationalities: Serb, Croat, Bulgarian, Romanian, and even Bosnian Muslims and Albanians within the Hungarian component of the Dalmatian Peninsula, which was a part of the Habsburg Empire. So the idea of instability in the Balkans was guaranteed to create problems for Austria-Hungary. So when the idea of a big Bulgaria was floated by the Treaty of San Stefano, Austro-Hungarian Empire began to be concerned that a creation of a Balkan state would trigger a new wave of Balkan nationalism, which would lead to the disintegration not merely of the Ottoman Empire but also of the Habsburg Empire. In 1886, therefore, when Britain stood forth in defense of Bulgaria, Austria really did not know which way to look except to make certain that it does not affect the relations in the Balkan region as a whole. Their principal aim was to keep Russia out of the Balkans, and in order to do that, they even supported the creation of the very same Bulgaria which they had opposed in 1878. Between 1886, which is the creation of Bulgaria, and let's say around 1906, there was a major change that took place in the world of Balkan nationalism. Because from this point of time, Russia began to see that its policy of creating satellites in the Balkans was no guarantee of access to the Mediterranean. They helped create Bulgaria, but Bulgaria was denying them access to the Mediterranean. So they considered the other and what was till then the most unthinkable option. Russia now began to underwrite the unity and integrity of the Ottoman Empire. And they came close to each other. Istanbul and St. Petersburg came close to each other, with Istanbul guaranteeing to keep the straits closed to any adversarial navy, that is to say, the British Navy, and allow Russians open access through the straits all through. In return, Russia pledged military and diplomatic support to Istanbul. This situation lasted for more than a decade and a half, till there was a change of guard in Serbia. The question of Balkan nationalism, however, is a little more intricate. Because nationality, the issue of nationality was just emerging in this region for just around 40 or 50 years, and the battle lines of nationalism were not really fully drawn. The principal ingredient of nationalism in the various countries of Europe had always been language. In the Balkans, language was a pretty tricky thing, because the various nationalities that later identified themselves as nationalities, the Slavs, the Croats, the Bosnia-Herzegovinians, they all spoke a language in common, which is Serbo-Croat. They just spoke different dialects. In fact, even the Bulgarian people spoke a language which was from the same Slavic family. Again, it stemmed from a different dialect. But by and large, the languages were so close that together all of these people used to be known as the Yugoslavs. When Bulgaria was allowed to have Rumelia merge into it in 1886, there was this additional development that Serbia and Romania were given completely independent status, independent, that is to say, of the Ottoman Empire. The new states of Serbia and Romania had then resulted in new dynamics of the relationship, particularly Serbia and its relations with Bulgaria. Serbia, the land of Serbia that emerged out of the 1886 Mediterranean agreements, was a landlocked state, and it had two options. It could either move westward into the Dalmatian Peninsula, take Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia to reach the Adriatic Sea, or it could reach eastwards into the Macedonian region and the Rumelian region to reach the Aegean Sea. In the immediate aftermath of the Mediterranean agreements, Austrian support for the independence of Serbia was actually underwritten by the fact that the Austro-Hungarian decision to create or to support the creation of an independent Serbia was underwritten by the fact that a dynasty favorable to Vienna had actually seized power. This is the Obrenović dynasty. And after 1886, for a period of around 10 years or so, Austria-Hungary began to diplomatically support the Obrenović agenda of creating a larger Serbia by moving eastwards, that is, away from the Dalmatian Peninsula. The Obrenović dynasty of Serbia pushed for a policy of eventually acquiring Macedonia and in order to reach the Adriatic Sea. This, the Bulgarians would come out and resist, and in this decision, the Russians began to support the Bulgarians. So the conflict in the Balkans, both the Bulgarians and the Serbians were waging in the name of their independent respective nation states. Serbia was thinking in terms of a greater Slavic region touching the Adriatic. Bulgaria also wanted to move southwards for the very same reason. On the other hand, once the Serbian expansion eastwards were thwarted, Serbia decided to move westwards into the Dalmatian Peninsula, which brought Serbia into direct conflict with Austria. This was made possible by a change of guard in the Serbian capital Belgrade, with the Obrenovićes being replaced by the Karađorđević, with diplomatic support from Russia. In fact, with the rise of the Karađorđevićes in Serbia in power in Belgrade, Russia once again reversed its Balkan policy, hoping to create an independent and large Serbian nation which would then guarantee Russia the access it needed to the Mediterranean. The westward expansion of Serbia ultimately brought Serbia into conflict with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the region of Bosnia-Herzegovina. As the westward expansion began, or the agenda of westward expansion was begun by Serbia, Austria-Hungary decided to move in and annex Bosnia-Herzegovina into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 also followed as a sequel to these developments. Because Serbia's pushing the case of Slavic nationalism coincided with the rise of Slavic nationalism inside the limits of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Fed up with Magyar misrule in the region, the Croats and the Bosnia-Herzegovinians, but fighting for their own Slavic space in the name of Yugoslav nationalism, Serbia embraced this cause in a bid to reach the westward sea of the Adriatic. When the war began, the Great War began in 1914, it was as a result, as we know, of the assassination of Archduke of Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian member of a secret society called the Black Hands. What is interesting to note is that the assassination took place because if the Archduke's policy of creating a three-tier federation where the Slavic people would be given something like an autonomous province inside the Bosnia-Herzegovina, if that policy had worked, it had succeeded, then Serbian agenda of westward expansion and creating a Yugoslav state would have been defeated. As a result, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated by a member of the Serbian Black Hands organization, and when Austria decided to push for a military solution by crushing the ambition of Serbia, they decided to deliver an ultimatum in July 1914. Serbia, backed by Russia, decided to reject the ultimatum. Germany decided to support Austria's bid to push for a military resolution, and Europe was dragged into the Great War. So it is not wrong to suggest that in the end, the Eastern question in its metamorphosed form of the issue of Balkan nationalism finally dragged Europe into the depths of the darkness of 1914.